Thank you all for coming to our event today. I really appreciate you all taking time out of your day to join us for a conversation, which I hope will be a free-flowing conversation that everyone will feel free to join in and ask questions and to participate. This conversation is designed to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. This is the executive order that President Roosevelt signed 75 years ago yesterday, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just 1 minute. But before I get started with the content of what we're going to be talking about today, I wanted to thank some people. First of all, I wanted to thank Dr. Jeremy Murray, who's in the back. Jeremy Murray asked me if I wanted to talk at some point about Japanese American history, and this being the 75th anniversary, I said, yes, of course. We really need to hold something on campus, and so I wanted to thank him for initiating this and doing all of the heavy lifting to get this started and to at least initiate this idea. Cesar Caballero represents many different groups. Would you like to speak and welcome everyone? He's the Dean of the Library, and I'll hand it over to him. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, as we say in Spanish. My name is Cesar Caballero. I'm Dean of the Library. I'm also chair of the University Diversity Committee. So I'd like to kind of officially welcome you to the library at CSUSB, where we're really glad to host these events. And let me just say that the University Diversity Committee has created the Yodi Talks. It's a series of presentations, brief presentations on current issues of current importance, like today's presentation. And I'll be brief about this. Let me just say, I find this topic very timely for what's happening today in our country and probably throughout the world. I guess I don't have to say a lot about that. There are some leaders in our country who seem compelled to demonize certain segments of our society. Most currently, refugees, immigrants, Mexicanos, bed hombres, as some people would say. So it's interesting to see how this is playing out, but it's a way for us to reflect. And what better way than to talk about history and how things happened and why. So I really thank Dr. Lyons and Dr. Lyon and Dr. Murray for setting this up as part of the Yodi Talks at our university. So without more ado, let me just hand it over then to Dr. Lyon, who I believe is going to introduce the panel presenters. Thank you very much.
So let me first make just a couple of remarks about the importance of why we're here today, and then I'd like to present our panelists. First of all, Executive Order 9066 is often cited as the executive order that allowed for Japanese Americans to be forced from their homes and to put into incarceration camps for the duration of the war. But it wasn't just one act that did this. The ideas behind it had been floating around for a very, very long time. There were laws that were passed throughout U.S. history that used race as a category for exclusion and for limited rights that we have forgotten, I think, in the post-World War II period. After the end of World War II, I think the world realized what it looks like when racism is taken to its extreme. And we have since developed what I would hope would be a common sensibility that those kinds of actions are not acceptable on any level, but we seem to continue to fight these battles, and they never go away entirely. Executive Order 9066 was the mechanism, and I've passed it around if you haven't received one already, a copy of the order. It was the mechanism that allowed the military to designate zones from which anyone could be excluded. This was written in this way in order to comply with the U.S. Constitution, which in 1868 had an amendment added which declared that all persons, regardless of citizenship, are owed due process under the law. In 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that this applied even to Chinese immigrants who at the time were excluded from immigration and citizenship by law. All persons were owed due process and equal protection. So we have this constitutional guarantee, and yet there were people seeking opportunities to strip Japanese Americans of US citizenship, find ways to deport all persons of Japanese ancestry, and in the absence of being able to do that, at least create concentration camps where all persons of Japanese ancestry could be held for the duration of the war. These ideas were being discussed in Congress as early as fall of 1941, well before Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And in their conversations, as they were trying to make that law legal, one particular representative said, "Aren't we beating the devil around the bush? Don't we just simply want to imprison all people of Japanese ancestry?" On the twilight between war and peace, that is a very difficult thing for us to do, but I'm sure if war comes, new opportunities, new options will become available, and we saw that happen. The executive order was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19th, but many more actions had to take place after that. The military had to create the zones from which anyone could be excluded. Public laws had to be passed to allow the military to declare that all Japanese persons of Japanese ancestry, euphemistically called aliens and non-aliens, had to report for entry into assembly centers, and so on. Japanese American men who were of American birth and US citizenship were stripped of their right to serve in the military by being labeled enemy aliens and ineligible for service, and so on. So there were many, many different pieces to how it was in the first year of the war that Americans of Japanese ancestry and Japanese immigrant parents were stripped of their rights and were put into this unconstitutional situation. Today, the lesson of Japanese American history is wielded in a couple of different ways. Sometimes as a reminder of what was done in the past, and sometimes by people who say it was an unfortunate necessity of war that could be brought out again in times of extreme panic or in times of wartime necessity. And I would just urge everyone to be cautious of wartime necessity as a justification for illegal, unconstitutional acts. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has some tips for how to talk about difficult issues, difficult topics in history, like the Holocaust, but it also applies to what we're going to talk about today. And I'll just highlight 2 points. One, numbers need to be translated into personal human terms. So today, I've invited some people to talk about their own personal connections with this history and their own families' experiences. And 2, never accept simple answers for complex questions. The question of what happened during World War II, the question of what is happening today, these are complex questions, and they can't be answered on Twitter, they can't be answered on Facebook, they can't be answered with one-liners. They're answered with a 2-hour conversation, deliberative and careful and thoughtful conversations. So I would like to introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to ask Jim Hachiya to speak to us today. He was born right before World War II broke out for the United States in September 1941. His family was sent to Jerome, Arkansas, and to Hart Mountain, Wyoming. He already had 2 siblings before then. 2 brothers, additional brothers, were born in Jerome, Arkansas, and a sister was born in Hart Mountain, Wyoming. Dr. Eri Yasuhara, who is a retired professor of Japanese and our past Dean of Arts and Letters, will also be talking about her grandfather, who was an immigrant who was at least put into 2 camps that we know of, possibly 3, and also experienced quite a diversity of experiences being in Tule Lake. Doug Urata is here to talk about his father's experience, And some of you may know Jim Urata, who was a very important member of our campus community, being in charge of facilities, of capital planning, and many of the things that have made this campus what it is today. Stuart Sumida, professor of biology, is well known for his work with Pixar Disney Studios animations. I'll never watch Kung Fu Panda the same again. And he brings another layer of diversity to our conversation. His family, he's third generation. His family came by way of Hawaii and really reminds us that Japanese American history is diverse. It includes Hawaii as well. And understanding what happened requires us to really think about the complexity and the diverse lives that individuals brought to this particular situation. That's it for me. I'll be asking questions of the panelists at the end, and I would invite you guys to ask questions as well. So, Jim, can I hand the microphone over to you?
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Hachia. I was born September 1941, December 7th, Pearl Harbor, February, Executive Order 9066 was signed, and shortly after that, my older brother and older sister, mother and father, were interned into what is it? The racetracks over here, Santa Anita. You know, so we were there for a few months there before we were sent to Jerome, Arkansas. And in Jerome, I have two brothers that were born in Jerome, Kenji and Kiyoshi. And then we were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where my little sister, Mitsue, was born. And my mother was born in Signal Hill, California. My father was born in Portland, Oregon. And they were from, both of them were from, their parents were from Okayama, Japan. That's near Hiroshima, fairly close to Hiroshima. And they met in, they didn't live in the same village, but close villages. And their marriages were arranged, and when they got married in Japan, and they came to America for the second time, and then my brothers and sisters were born. And I think the most important part of the internment for me personally was my mother and father. There were 6 of us after the internment, and shortly after coming out of the internment, my father was not healthy. He contracted TB, and there were thousands of other males predominantly contracted TB, and so I remember my father making a telephone call. We were living, when we were relocated, we were in Long Beach, and my father had to make a telephone call to the hospital or someplace regarding his health. And shortly after, he was placed into a sanitarium in Pasadena, California. And he and other Japanese Americans, they were there, and they had contracted tuberculosis. And so he was in the sanitarium. My mother, uh, 6 kids, and she had to take care of 6 kids, and we were living in what we call trailer parks provided by the government, of course. And shortly after that, we moved into other government housing projects. And in our projects, there were quite a few Japanese Americans living there, as well as uh, round-eyed white people. And over on the other side of Santa Fe Avenue in Long Beach uh, were quite a few African Americans. They lived over on the other side. Most of them, I guess, they lived there because their parents were connected with the military in some form, and they provided government housing. But uh, that was that part there with the health of my father. Uh, uh, I blame it on the government, the Congress, uh, that placed us in the homes and made him unhealthy, and then the struggles that my mother had. Uh, he returned uh, after about 2 or 3 years in the sanitarium, and then started his life over again. He started working in Los Angeles as a salesperson, life insurance salesman, and I lost my father when I was a teenager, while I was in high school, and it was directly related to his poor health that he had contracted in the camps. And but the thing about the camps is that my brothers and sisters, we've never discussed this with my mother and father in the homes in all these years. Uh, and my daughter and son, they have never discussed this with my experience, and it's why I'm not sure. I guess just like if you had seen the movie Relevance, I guess it has something to do with shigata ganai, or just it can't be helped, and just didn't talk about it. And but another point, even today, which makes it relevant is the press. Today, we are told that the press is the enemy, and I I don't look at the press as the enemy. I look at the press uh, as the good guys today. But when I was born, at that time, the press, the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, they were the bad people because they were promoting uh, internment, and to gather all the Japanese Americans into the camps. And it's coming around in full circle with the another executive order by our President Trump banning the Muslim, and it's very, very relevant from what they did to the Japanese Americans 75 years ago compared to what they're doing today. And we must have a free, uh, healthy press to continue that, history does not repeat itself. What happened to my mother and father and other Japanese Americans. Thank you.
Okay, okay. All right. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for sharing that, Jim. Well, as everyone has been pointing out, executive orders are very much in the news today. Who knew that when the 75th anniversary of 9066 came around, its commemoration would unfortunately have such relevance to current events. I want to thank Jeremy and Tristan for providing this, putting this event together and providing this opportunity to commemorate Executive Order 9066 and to consider the immense power of executive orders, okay, to disrupt lives, destroy communities, and change families forever. I'm also reminded of another panel on which I spoke, one that was held on campus in 2001. I don't know how many of you were here at the time, probably not most of you, but in the wake of the terrorist attack of September 11th in New York. I was invited to participate and to speak as a Japanese American, a member of an ethnic community that had suffered historic wrongs as a result of war hysteria and racism. I do remember being introduced as someone who had herself experienced internment. Apologies to Jim, but I want to start my remarks by pointing out that I wasn't quite that old. Thank you very much. I'm a post-war baby boomer baby, and you know you were, but you just barely made it in because you were just a baby, right? Just 2 months old or 3 months old. So, but I did have. A close relative who was interned, my grandfather, my mother's father, named Matsutaro Fujita, and it's his life that I'd like to share with you today. I was only 14 when he died. He was 77. And like most children in their early teens, I had no understanding of, nor unfortunately any interest in, his life and what had happened to him during the war. In my defense, I'd like to point out that he was a very taciturn man, not at all given to much talking or sharing. And second, you know, the community itself in the late 50s and 60s was silent on the matter as well. I think both Issei and Nisei, you all know the terms, right? Issei, Nisei, okay. Were busy rebuilding their lives after the camps. And one can also understand the very human desire, you know, to close a very, very unhappy chapter and just simply move on. So almost all the information I have about my grandfather comes from my mother. Oh, and Tristan has given me some very good links and information and phone numbers to the National Archives. I plan to do a lot more research and get other information eventually. Well, so my grandfather Matsutaro Fujita was born in 1885 in Wakayama Prefecture, which is it's not too far from Okayama, which is where your folks come from. It's in the western part of Japan. He came to the U.S. to make his fortune, like many young Japanese men of the time. He is said to have either witnessed or experienced the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906. That's the story in the family, within a few months of his arrival. And so from that I surmise, and this I can check with records, but he arrived in California either early in 1906 or late 1905, and he would have been 20 years old at that time. He was back in Japan in 1918. I don't know if that was his first trip back or he had been back before. He married my grandmother, Katsuno Matsumoto. They returned to Stockton, California, where my mother was born in December of 1918. It turns out my grandmother was pregnant with my mother during the voyage, which must have been really a lot of fun, I know. My grandfather was a laborer, okay, he worked primarily in agriculture, at least at the time, although he did a lot of different things. I believe he had some sort of supervisory or foreman type of job with some Mexican migrants. I think that's a possibility. There's a really interesting interface there between the two groups. And afterward, later, if there's more time, there's a really interesting story about my grandmother and tortillas that I'd love to tell later. They had 2 more children. Then in either 1923 or 24, my mother would have been about 5 and a half. My grandmother and her 3 children went back to Japan to live, with my grandfather staying here, working, sending them money, and then he went back to see them at least once, probably more often. I say at least once because a 4th daughter was born in 1931 or 32 in Japan, so there was at least one more visit, okay? There were probably several reasons for this separation. It was not at all unusual for Issei parents to send their U.S.-born children to Japan for both short and actually more often very long-term stays in order that they receive a Japanese education. They wanted to make sure of that, many Issei, and of course to get to know and bond with their Japanese relatives. Um, it happened more often, however, that the children were a little bit older than my mother and her sisters, and that they were sent by themselves, with the mother, staying behind to take care of the family over here. Um, in my grandfather's case, I think being a man, alone, even if married, made it, I think, much easier to go where the jobs were. Okay, there was this whole thing about you take a blanket and you can go anywhere, especially if you're a laborer. A further note on such Nisei who grew up in Japan, if and when they returned to the U.S., they were known as Kibei, Kibei Nisei, or Nisei who had returned to America. Some ended up stranded in Japan when the war started. There are documented stories of brothers finding themselves fighting on opposite sides. In the U.S., the Kibei often served the war effort here as extremely proficient translators and interpreters because of their language knowledge. Okay. In the mid to late 1930s, I'm thinking 36 or 37, after graduating what used to be called the Jogakko, it's about roughly equivalent to high school. My mother came back to the U.S., so she at that point became a Kibei, and lived for several years with her father, my grandfather, in Southern California. They were, some of these names may be familiar to some of you. They were on Terminal Island for a time. They were in San Dimas, just down the freeway, working for a Japanese flower grower. Apparently, there was a wholesale sort of grower of flowers. Every time we'd take her, on the 210, it was in the San Dimas sign came on, the same story came out. Oh, I used to be here. Okay. She was also a schoolgirl. I don't know if you've heard that term before, working as a live-in babysitter for the wife of the Japanese consul general in Pasadena while she went to a sewing school. Well, while my mother was in the U.S., excuse me, all of her younger sisters died of illness in Japan. And as U.S. Japan relations deteriorated, my grandfather decided to send my mother back to Japan so as not to leave her mother by herself. They spent the war years separated, my mother and her mother in Wakayama, my grandfather in the U.S. in internment camps. They all survived, obviously, but my mother and grandmother narrowly escaped with their lives and only the clothes on their backs when the B-29s firebombed Wakayama in I believe it was 1945. So on one side of the Pacific internment, the other side of the Pacific firebombings. So I had always heard from my mother that my grandfather was at Manzanar and Tule Lake. But when I did some research at the Japanese American National Museum, the one in Little Tokyo, some years ago, this is before they moved to their nice new building, I discovered that he had been at, I think, Rower. I know there was another, was it Jerome? Okay, because he wasn't at Rower. Okay, thank you. So it was Jerome. The staffer at the museum assured me, though, that it's entirely possible that my grandfather was at Manzanar and Tule Lake and Jerome. Okay, it was not that unusual for internees to move around, and since he was by himself, he didn't have to worry about uprooting his family and so on. I do believe the staffer for the following reason. My mother was, when she told the story, my mother was at very great pains to explain that my grandfather was at Tule Lake only because he had at that point decided that he wanted to be repatriated to Japan after the war in order to rejoin his wife and daughter. Now, at that time, again, I didn't understand the significance of this rationale. Why is she telling me this? I don't really care. But because those at Tule Lake were, of course, considered troublemakers, right? Or worse. And my mother didn't want me to think that of her father. In other words, she had every reason to try to sort of hide my grandfather's presence at Tule Lake, but she didn't. She explained it, but she didn't. And, of course, there's no reason at all to try to hide his presence at Manzanar. So if she says he was there, I believe he was there. Okay. So Manzanar it is. Back in Japan after the war, my parents had gotten married. My grandfather had managed to locate his wife and daughter through the Red Cross. I was born, my sister was born. I was born in Japan. My sister and I were both born in Japan. Life was pretty hard in Japan after the war, and my parents made the decision to emigrate to America. Immigration from Japan was still very strictly regulated at the time. The 1924 Immigration Act was still in force, But we immigrated under a family reunification provision. My grandfather, as head of the family, was able to arrange for his wife, his daughter, son in law, and his 2 grandchildren to join him in the United States. We settled in the mid 1950s in the San Gabriel Valley, first in San Gabriel, then in Rosemead, if any of you know where those cities are. We spent a couple years up in Monterey as well. There's a couple of postscripts that I want to tell before I finish up, and then afterwards, I'm sure Tristan will, moderate some discussion about some other things. My grandfather, at the time of the war, was a member of the Salvation Army. He was a Christian at the time, and he had a Bible with him, a small Bible, during some kind of interview, whether it was the sort of intake interview at the first camps, that he had to go into, whether it was, I have no idea. But he told my mother, who then told me later, that when the officer or the official who was interviewing him saw the Bible, his attitude changed for the better. Okay? Bible. Christian. Oh, maybe not so bad enemy. I have no idea. But that was something that stuck in my memory. My grandfather was certain that it was the Bible that made that situation just a little easier. And then a final postscript, which is really quite ironic. Japanese nationals were not allowed to apply for citizenship, okay, until I think after the war. The 1952 McCarran-Walter Act did that. But my mother always said that my grandfather, at the first opportunity he had, he studied and he became a U.S. citizen. So that was a final, very interesting irony. Why don't I stop there and continue?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come out and make this presentation. I'm kind of carrying on from my father. My father used to give presentations about what he called internment or evacuation, the euphemisms that were used back in those days, all around San Bernardino to service clubs and classes and so on. So it's an honor to be able to carry on the tradition. So I thought I'd throw together some slides to give you maybe a little better visualization of what it is they went through in going into the internment. As you said, it was 75 years and one day ago that this happened. These 2 images are from the Poston internment camp where my parents were incarcerated in Poston, Arizona, near Parker, near the Colorado River. Now, before the war, they had a pretty good life. This is my mom. She's the one on the, I think, on the next to the right. She's a twin. So you can tell. Her father was very successful, owned some restaurants in San Diego, and they built their own red tile adobe brick house in San Diego in a lousy area, but that's the only place they could get land. But they did have a nice house, and see, they did pretty well. That's my mom and her sister in kimonos when they were kids, and another photo of my mom when she's a little bit older. I really like this picture. And she was about 14 or 15 years old then. My parents met when my father and his family moved from Los Angeles to San Diego. Now, my father had gone to UCLA for a couple of years, but then he had to drop out because they were taking over my great-aunt's business in San Diego, so the whole family moved down there, and he dropped out of school. Now, this is Santa Anita Racetrack. So we're talking about where they assembled in Santa Anita. This is, you see the guards here, and you see them lining up. And what they went into were horse stables. As someone mentioned the other day, when they went in there, they said, this is for you, and it was a shovel. Because what they had to do was shovel out the manure out of the horse stables before they could move in. So if you can imagine that, that's their conditions they had. From there, they went on trains, and sometimes Stephen too, they're in trains. They're blacked out, they had no idea where they're going, and they end up in all over the country, maybe in Jerome, Arkansas, or in Hart Mountain, Nebraska, and places like that. So there are 10 war relocation centers. That's what they were euphemistically called back in those days. And this is what they got into. This is Poston when they first started out. See the soldier patrolling the borders there. It was very hot, very dry, very dusty. They spent a lot of their times doing things like watering down the dust so it wouldn't go through all that. When I was born, I had asthma and whatever. I probably wouldn't have survived this condition just because, and a lot of instances that infants did not survive because of the horrendous, dust and the heat that happened in places like this. Now, Poston is in Arizona, so it's pretty consistently hot. Manzanar, probably the most well-known internment incarceration camp, is up in the Owens Valley. Gets very hot and very cold. So, you've seen pictures of that as well. This is typical of the inside of the barracks. They had some sheets and curtains hung up between, so families really had no privacy there at all. And anybody see the movie Allegiance? Okay, if you haven't seen it, if you get a chance to see it, if it ever comes out in theater again, see it. It's a play that was produced by George Takei, and it was done in Broadway. They did film it for broadcast. It's been done twice in the theaters on special occasions, and it's I hope it comes out on DVD at some point, but it's a really interesting way and also examines very carefully the very difficult decisions people made back in those days. I always tell people, I don't know what I would have done had I been alive and been an adult at that point. It's a very difficult thing to deal with. The Japanese Americans there, when they get bored, they get a little creative. You see there's a little miniature island and boats and things like that. And this is in Poston. And if you see a lot of these places, they did create gardens out of nothing. Actually, a lot of them had experience because they created farms out of nothing back in the day. Like in the Central Valley, they used to dig through hardpan this deep to create the farms that they created back then. These are my parents. This is the closest you're going to see of a wedding picture because this is right after they're married. They met in San Diego, but they continued their romance into the camps, which I have no idea how that happened. And they got married in camp. My mom was 18, my dad was 22. So he kind of robbed the cradle a little bit. Okay, so during the internment, they were able to leave the camps as long as they went east. And so they had a work release. My dad ended up getting a commitment that he could live in the nice, balmy area of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So going from one extreme to the other. Their idea of a refrigerator was a box nailed outside the window because that's how you kept food cold back then. And of course, as Kirsten said, that they were denied their American citizen rights. My dad tried to volunteer for the Army during the war, but from 1942 to 1943, they're classified 4C enemy aliens, and so he could not enlist. Of course, after they got there, got settled, my mom had my oldest sister, he got drafted. So he ended up going into the military intelligence service to train as a linguist. This is a picture of, on my father's side, that's my great aunt, whose business they took over in San Diego. My grandfather, my grandmother, who I knew. My grandfather, he passed away in camp. And his greatest regret was he had nothing to pass on to his sons, because that's a very traditional thing in Japanese. And that's my oldest sister there, and of course my mom. My father was allowed to come out of the military to go to his bedside while he was still sick, but they wouldn't let him back out to go to his funeral. And this is later on. Again, my grandmother, my mom, and her 3 children. My grandmother's 3 children. My dad, my aunt, and my uncle. Both of the men were in the military intelligence service. They served in the occupation after the war was over. So they kind of got in a little bit late. And that's my oldest sister. One thing about camp, and I use that term advisedly because that's how we all refer to it as. It was rather amusing. My wife is Korean American, but she kind of looks Japanese to a lot of people. So when we go to some place with a lot of older Japanese, they look at her and say, "What camp are your parents in?" And she says, "I went to a Korean kids camp. What are you talking about?" So, had to explain that, and go through that. But, this is camp. And camp really unified people for generations. This is 1994. How many years that was after the internment. And they got together, and they finally, I think they had the last reunion a couple of years ago because people are just getting too old to get around. But this is one thing that they went to. Oh, my parents? Oh, sorry. They're right there. Um, is funny. 10 years after that is my parents' 60th anniversary, and they had a reunion in Las Vegas. And I snuck in there and surprised them and wished them a happy anniversary in front of the whole crowd there. It was a lot of fun. After the war, they came back to San Diego. This is Mary's lunch. This is Mary. That's my great aunt. Her real name was Isa Shimoda. And to her right is my grandmother, her sister. And when they came back, the Army had commandeered this little restaurant in Cannery Row in San Diego to take over as a mess hall. When they left, they took everything. So my dad was still in the Army in Japan. My mom and relatives went in, had to refurbish the whole thing and start all up again. So they had a little help. I'll point out a couple people. It's my dad, my mom. Yeah, that's me. My sister Phyllis here, and my sister Emily here, and every aunt and uncle and cousin that was around the time is in that photo. Oh, her sister's not in there. Her sister married someone from Central Valley, so she doesn't parlor. So after a few years of that, my dad decided he wanted to finish school. So taking his pre years at UCLA, he managed to be accepted to San Diego State, as it was called back then, and he got a degree in industrial arts. And this is his graduation picture. And he was a little ahead of my sister, who's the second from the right. She was starting college a couple years after he did. But he graduated and taught industrial arts at Claremont High School in Claremont, California, down by San Diego, not the one in the San Gabriel Valley here. But lo and behold, his department chair in San Diego was a fellow by the name of Dr. Ken Phillips. And Dr. Phillips called him up, I remember it was Halloween 1962, and said, "Hey, Jim, how would you like a job?" And he invited him to come up to San Bernardino to what was going to be called Cal State, San Bernardino Riverside State College at the time. Okay, so they didn't have a site. This place was vineyards back then. I know because we used to roam around on here looking at it. And that's my dad and Dr. Joe Thomas, who was his boss then. And they were looking at plans for this campus before it became a campus. So I was imbued in this original design. They used to have what they call the 7.5 minute circle, where you can get from one point of the campus to the other within 7.5 minutes. So, as I told Kirsten, one of the things I remember my dad doing is he took out his drafting board and designed the first parking sticker. It was like this big, and it had little lines on it and numbers and Cal State. So that's how far my history of my dad goes with this campus. And then also Dr. John Fow, who this building is named after, they were close colleagues during work, but they got to be very good friends once he retired. My dad always respected authority, which he imbued into me, maybe a little too much. And so he refrained from being friends with Dr. Fow when they were working together. I mean, they were friendly, but then after they both retired, they got to be very good friends. And John and Trine were very good friends, my parents. One last slide. This is my dad doing one of those many talks around the city of San Bernardino, talking about the internment. I remember one of my first book reports in junior high school was a book that America's Concentration Camps by Alan Bosworth. And so I was well versed in internment and not so much the military, amazingly enough, during that time. And what's interesting though is that he always had people saying, well, you guys were the enemy. Well, no, we're mostly citizens, and combating that. Some of the things I have here are from my dad's. He had a box in the garage labeled evacuation, and so that all came from that. Now, one of the things I want to show you is I still have that poster, by the way. This is one my nephew got me that is in a little better shape. This is actually one that was hung, I think it was in Alameda County, telling people when they had to get out. this is a really heavy document to see. And then there are a lot of other things here. Some of these things are yearbooks from Manzanar as well as Poston that you can look through. One of the things I think is interesting here is this is from my dad's time in the military intelligence service. Very detailed maps of Japan showing where things were. So when they invaded Japan, they'd be ready to identify those types of things. Also, there's a whole stack. These are all reunion yearbooks from all the different reunions over the many years that they had them. This is a little copy of the newsletter from Santa Anita Racetrack. The rumor is you have 3 Japanese together, there's a newspaper. Something that happened. And maybe most importantly, this, and I haven't had time to go through all of it, when the records were released in the archives, my dad asked for a copy. This is everything about my parents, my grandparents, what happened to them, and internment, things that happened afterwards, including I saw a price list of what it cost to refurbish the Russians that you saw up there. So there's a lot of documentation there. That kept everything. And also in the box down there, I have stacks of letters to the editor. And these things are very disturbing because there are people who to this day, and you still hear that, and even in some of the conversations obviously we've had lately, that this was just somehow justified. That was not justified. There was no evidence of any kind of malfeasance or treason or terrorism ever established. And it's one of those things that I think needs to be said. There's a lot of debate now. I mean, we do. Japanese Americans have supported the Muslims in their efforts to not be discriminated against, and that's consistent. What's different, though, is that some differences in the execution of what's been happening. Japanese Americans are here as citizens and people who want to assimilate into the society here. It's not going so well sometimes for people who are immigrating from other areas. There's some isolated areas. It's tougher for them to mix the different religions and backgrounds. So I think that's more of a challenge in those ways. So in some ways, I think there are some similarities, but there's some very, very distinct differences. And before I finish up, just want to mention one thing about the military service. I'm also involved with a group called the Go for Broke National Education Foundation, which recognizes and tries to memorialize the work of the Nisei veterans in the 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, the most highly decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the United States Army, 20 gold medals of honor, rather, and also the Military Intelligence Service, which is credited for shortening the war by a year and saving millions of lives in the Pacific. So those are things, too, that those people served, and they were doing it to be very much an example, or to put it as my dad used to say sometimes you just have to outwhite the white guy. So, so, think about that. It's kind of an interesting difference between the way the Japanese Americans have assimilated, maybe too much so into American society, versus what is happening now, where there are people that are maybe not assimilating as much and maybe not as willing to. So I think that's a difference that does need to be recognized when you talk about the difference between Japanese American situation and what's going on today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming today. I have to say first and foremost that it's an honor to get to join this group. I feel like an interloper in a way, but we do have a family story, and I appreciate Sherson asking me to relate it to you because it's slightly different from the story we usually hear. For a long time, we didn't hear the story, and it was unfortunate. But the story has become romanticized in some ways. The model minority, making it seem like it wasn't as hard as it really was, and that's unfortunate. It was very hard, and there are some pieces to it that we don't always think about, and I appreciate Tristan inviting me to add a tiny piece to that. My father's family came from Hiroshima. My grandfather, Gosaku Sumida, came to Hawaii as a laborer, as many Japanese did, throughout the United States. Of course, at the time it wasn't a state, but it was an American territory. I was actually born the year it became a state. That was a big deal in our family, actually. My grandmother was a picture bride who joined him there a number of years later. And I met and knew my grandfather only a bit. I was quite young when he passed away. My grandmother, Kaname Sumida, lived to the ripe old age of 102. But what was interesting is that neither of them ever spoke of the internment. They never spoke of the camps. Everybody knew my grandfather had been in a camp, but he never spoke of it. The only people in the family who spoke of it were a couple of his children, and only a couple. My grandmother had 14 children, and as a biologist, I got to tell you, that's being pregnant for 11 years. That's insane. I can't even, that's beyond my comprehension. One did not survive, but 13 did, and my father's amongst the younger of them, which, ironically, I was born in Milwaukee because my father, post-war, wound up going to Marquette University, and that's where he met my mother, who joined the Hawaii Club at Marquette to meet guys. She didn't even go to Marquette. She just thought Asian guys were hot. So so there you are. But it was interesting. Our families, as Doug mentioned to you, people didn't have. They might have a nice house, but it was never in a nice place. Our family's home was in the muck next to Pearl Harbor. It was sort of swampy and not very good land. There was another family right next door with the same name and utterly unrelated to us that did their best to run a watercress patch there. But my grandfather ran a gas station, which way back in the day was Flying A, before it became Phillips 66, before it became a variety of other things. My earliest recollection of visiting the family home, which is still in the same spot, was a very large box. It had to be large because there were 13 kids. And it was painted as sort of a gunmetal blue, which we found out was the cheapest free paint you could get from the government. But there were still bullet holes in the house from when it was shot up, when the attack took place. The only reference my grandfather ever made to the war or anything was that he refused to fix the bullet holes. He painted them over, but he refused to fix the bullet holes. And that is the only story we ever heard as children. And then the information that I got was all from my father. And as many of you may know, very few people from Hawaii were sent to camps. Hawaii was an island, is an island. And so people were allowed to stay. It's not well known that there is one camp on the island in Hawaii, as some of you probably know, which has a long, unpronounceable name full of alternating consonants and vowels that makes even Japanese names look simple. But my grandfather, when he immigrated, as I said, was a laborer. And his first job was to help dig the tunnel that goes from one side of Oahu to the other. And he saved his money. He was single, as the case that Ari mentioned. That was the easiest way to be a laborer. And he saved his money until he could lease and eventually buy the land in which the family gas station was set up. When the order came through, Hawaii was not considered a zone necessarily. It was an unusual, in the history of Hawaii, in terms of the internments, are interesting and complicated in and of themselves. But he was considered a threat because he ran a gas station. The official explanation, the initial, I should say, explanation, was that he had the opportunity to put diesel fuel into drums, and he could take it out to, potentially take it out to Japanese submarines. And his response was, and I only know this from my youngest uncles, I don't pump diesel, and I don't own a boat, and do you know how quickly a rowboat would sink with a 50-gallon drum of diesel in it? That didn't matter. What we found out later, only much later, was that it was primarily because he had helped to dig those tunnels. And it was considered that he had strategic information and the ability to use explosives. And his response to that, apparently, and I only found this out very recently, is like, they just gave us shovels. We didn't get any help. Now, the reason I only learned some of these things very recently is, one, as you know, lots of people didn't talk about it. And I have to say, Doug, I'm very, very pleased and impressed to hear that your father did, because it's an important thing to do. But my grandparents never spoke of it. My uncles who joined the Army never spoke of it. Those who were old enough to go didn't go to a camp because they joined the Army. And all the kids got to stay home with my grandmother. For years, I thought my grandfather was at Manzanar. And he was, briefly. He transitioned through the Assembly Center at Santa Anita. That is the only thing that we know of him actually discussing with my aunts and uncles, the horse stalls. Right? And as Doug mentioned, you had to clean it out before you could move into it. But he's a single man, and I have found out only this past year that it was because he was at Tule Lake. He was considered enough of a threat that he could be a danger for his so-called ability to give away what might have been strategic information, where you could bomb the island and disable the tunnel. And I only found this out because my car died, and my father, who lives in Apple Valley now, said, "Oh, you can borrow one of mine. I have two, and there's only one of me, and you can borrow one of mine." I said, "Great, thanks, Dad. I'll come up to your house." He goes, "Oh, my house in Nevada." Oh, okay. Well, so we drove to Nevada over the holiday break, and he said, "Well, we should stop at Manzanar. They have a new visitor center, and it is stunning, by the way. If you've not been, you should go. It's really an impressive facility." And while we were there, I said, "Well, where's his name on the wall?" He goes, "Oh, well, he was only here for a few weeks. He was at Tule Lake." I said, "The family has always been told that Ji-Chung was at Manzanar." He goes, "Well, he was, briefly. But again, it was because there was this stigma attached to Tule Lake. And my grandparents' generation was a silent generation in many ways. They didn't want to speak about it. My father, for decades, couldn't bear to mention that either. And he's in his 80s now, and only now has he been able to bring himself to speak about it. And my father is almost stereotypical, and sort of stoic Asian father kind of person. But when you're trapped in a car with someone, you can pepper them with questions, and eventually they start to break down. And I finally got him to talk about it a little bit. And so it's important for us to remember that some of us have to say something. The Japanese Americans were always thought of as the sort of the model minority, the success is the best revenge kind of story. See, if you're quiet and you're good, you will eventually win. Perhaps, but things move at different paces right now. So I spoke to my dad and I asked him, I said, "Dad, you should really come and do this instead of me." No, I can't do it. You should do it. You're a college professor. So I bring his greetings, but I also would like to say that you can tell that it still hurts. You can tell that there's still deep emotion attached to it, and in some ways stigma, which is not fair. We think that over the decades people have acknowledged that it was wrong, but there are generations, a few Issei and many Nisei left, who still have a very difficult time talking about it. And I applaud those who do. And so it is, in my opinion, incumbent on those of us who feel that we can, that we should. So when Kirsten first invited me, I thought, I don't deserve to get to do this, but on the other hand, it is important that somebody do. And so I feel honored to be in the presence of the other people here today. So my family story is an interesting one. And it reminds us that there's much greater complexity to this story than we sometimes realize. It reminds me that it is very easy to raise our voices, but we have to be it in two ways. We have to say something when we feel something is wrong, but we also have to be patient and be willing to. We can't fizzle out quickly. One of the things that has impressed me immensely, that'll be the last thing I'll say before we open it up with Kirsten. The things that has impressed me immensely is, although my grandparents' generation and my father's generation have been very quiet, very sort of almost restrictive in the way they've spoken about it, I have noticed a bunch of tiny little ladies the size and age of my aunties starting to say, no, this happened, don't do it again. And I understand that what's happening now is slightly different, but intolerance is intolerance. And if a tiny little 80-year-old woman can stand up and say, no, don't do that again, then people of my generation or people of my son's generations must be willing to do so as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for letting me share a few thoughts about my grandfather. So thanks.
So, what questions do you have? And I'll pass the microphone around so that we can get your response on camera. In the back.
I was going to say, what would happen to those who tried to escape the camps? What would be the repercussions?
Do you want me to answer? People were shot, even mostly not for trying to escape, but if someone got close. And in Topaz, someone did get close. There are competing stories about whether or not he was trying to get his dog, or if he was reaching through the fence to get something, or if he was actually quite a far distance from the fence, but he was shot in the back and killed. After that, the director of that camp, his response was to take away the bullets from the military to ensure that they would not kill anyone else in the future. So most of the places were located so far away from anywhere where you could get anywhere that escape wasn't really an issue. And a couple of years into the war, did anyone want to talk about personal stories? A couple of years into the war, people were able to get passes to leave. And also, in Manzanar in particular, it was kind of benign neglect. People would leave through the fence during the day or even for weeks at a time and go camping and fishing up in the Sierra Nevadas, and there was a fishing club and so on. So it wasn't something that people were too concerned about.
If you go to the visitor center at Manzanar now, you can actually get T-shirts that say Manzanar Fishing Club. Yeah, so and there's a sense of humor too. So.
Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to thank the panel for what was a very emotional but very sober presentation. And I'm so moved by the fact that, that you're still so moved by this, and there's still so much hurt in the community surrounding this awful incident in our history. And just to underscore Stuart's point about talking about this, I teach a lot of students, as does Kirsten and Danny and several others, who teach on this topic, on the topic of otherness and inequality. And I'm just always so blown away by the fact that my students know more about the Holocaust than they do about these things that happened in this country. And it's not that they shouldn't know about the Holocaust, but we should also recognize that we did some really bad things and that we need to acknowledge those things, because if we don't acknowledge them, they will happen again, as we have seen in our country. So, does anyone have any thoughts on the $20,000 that was given to the survivors of the camps?
I received my $20,000 in 1991 or thereabouts. And the sad thing about the $20,000 is that most of the people did not receive the $20,000 because they had passed away. It's either 40% that passed away by the time the 20,000 came around, or 60%. I don't know what figure was correct, but you know what I did with my $20,000? I had to pay my federal income tax with my 20,000 because I got into some trouble with the IRS, and and well, when the $20,000 came around, I had cash to pay the IRS.
That's fantastic.
This is a photocopy of my parents' checks. They actually came in when they were on vacation. My father told me, who I normally help them with their, financial stuff. Do not cash those checks. Don't put them in the bank. I want to see them. So here's a photocopy of them, along with the 2 copies of the letter from President Bush apologizing for what happened. So it's a very big thing for my family.
Thank you, Mary.
The copies of the checks that you have, would it be possible to archive a copy of them for our library for the students to see? Or is that too personal? Hopefully no social security numbers are on them.
No, I was looking at that. Let me look into it. I'm not sure if that's legal or not, so we'll find out. Yeah.
Yeah, because I grew up part of my childhood in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. And as a grade school student, I didn't even know that had happened. And yes, part of the history is that the bullet holes remain, even on Hickam Air Force Base. But now this is 2017. Do you know if the students are learning more about the encampments from K through 12?
I know the Japanese American Citizen League has had teacher training on the internment. That's been they're the California, I can't remember what it's on, Legal Education Fund, CLEF grant, Civil Liberties. And I know it's a silent P in there, isn't there? So what happened is that they created materials that they've done teacher training, but I don't think it's very widespread. You would know that more than me.
I spent my public education here in California, in Long Beach, California, and from kindergarten all the way through high school, never heard of what had happened to the Japanese Americans from my teachers, and I have been teaching public schools for 34 years in California and up in Northern California in Berkeley, and a colleague of mine asked me to speak to his students, and so uh, about 3 times I had talked to his students about the internment experience. Uh, and what is it? There is a film. It's called Farewell to Manzanar that was made about 25, 30 years ago, and that's available to all students as well as teachers in the public school system.
One other thing, there's an anecdote I read recently when I was doing some of the background on this, and there was a student at a school, I think it was the Midwest, and she wrote a paper about her family, about what happened during the war, and there's a picture of her grade on that paper. It's a big fat red F, and said, "This never happened, come see me after class." That's how much, that is not known even by professors at a university.
Um, I don't recall anymore how many years ago it was. I think maybe 8. I was asked to join a grant for the state of California to revisit our history standards and to beef up the sections that would include Japanese American internment. There is only one place in the standards for students in California where they could encounter Japanese American internment. I believe it's in 10th grade. Is that U.S. history? And it's under World War II, and there's just the option to talk about particularly the military and their contributions to the war effort, and just a slight opportunity to talk about Japanese American internment. So it's not a guarantee, and it's lucky if students get the material.
What about the new ethnic studies requirement? Is that what you're talking about?
No, just the history and social studies standards. And of course, those are being revised right now, so I haven't seen the new version. Yeah, good question. Yes.
My sons are younger than high school. Well, one's in high school now. In their K through 8 school, they do have a year where they do some U.S. history, and so I very purposely checked the textbook, and I counted 4 sentences about that, saying that, and it just said during World War II, Japanese Americans were illegally, they did use the term illegally, and inappropriately interned in, they didn't use the word concentration camps, they used the word relocation camps, and that it was, in the last sentence, is that it is one of the great controversial mistakes of American history. Now, to their credit, of those 4 sentences, one said it was a bad thing, but it only got 4 sentences.
And why was the term internment in quotes in the flyer? Is it because it's controversial to call it?
I did that because internment is a legal category, and 1,200 individuals were picked up by the FBI immediately following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they were processed through the Department of Justice into legal internment camps. That was not what most people experienced. There is due process involved. People have to have charges or some kind of evidence against them, and it's only something that's done for people who are citizens of countries against which we are at war. So this is a wartime procedure or legal category. The reason why I use internment still in the flyer is because that's usually what people know. That's the most common language. And so if we talked about the incarceration experience, people might not immediately know what we were talking about. So it's still useful, it's still used quite frequently, but it's extremely problematic because that is a legal category that was used for people. What? The language that's typically used, and I have to say I sat in a room with scholars and we talked about this for an hour, even though we all pretty much knew what our answers were. Forced removal and incarceration. A benign term that the National Park Service uses is confinement. But sick people are confined. Other people talk about detention, and people say that's what you get for being bad in school. So that the problem with it was the lack of any kind of legal termination or any kind of official terminology is not even available. There were signs that called the camps prison camps. Eleanor Roosevelt called them concentration camps. So there are many, many different words used. And there's a lot of publications. You can type in words matter, and there are a couple of people who have published on this. Roger Daniels is one of them, talking about what he considers to be the preferred terminology.
You mentioned the Park Service, and I know you won't toot your own horn, but you've done
Amazing work with our history club in terms of partnering with the Manzanar National Historic Site. And so also along with this idea of terminology and what kind of language is used, tracking your relationship with Manzanar and how, as a representative of the government, Manzanar has, the National Historic Site and the National Park Services has grappled with this issue. Have you seen changes over the past 10 years or so, for the better, for the worse, in terms of the kind of languages the language that's being used and the staff there, your relationship with them?
So I work with Manzanar, the History Club. How many of you guys have been on the digs? So our students go and participate in the public archaeology programs. Any of you are welcome to come over spring break the first weekend. The students are going back for a 5th year in a row to help clear out some of the archaeological features. And we work alongside community members. Japanese Americans from LA come, lots of family members whose relatives were in camp and so on. The thing that I've noticed the most is they're talking about Tule Lake, they're talking about the loyalty questionnaire, they're talking about the draft resistance, the new exhibition in the barracks talk about this issue and how difficult it was. And then they have a brand new exhibition that I haven't seen yet, a demonstration latrine, the women's latrine in Block 14, is now available for people to go through. So. I'll walk back.
I'm a very emotional person, so excuse me, I cry at a drop of a hat. I'll get through this. Okay. I really appreciate this. I found it by accident. I read the article that's in the LA Times that was yesterday. And I also have been keeping track of the exhibition that's going to be at the Japanese National Museum in LA. It started on the 18th, that I am definitely going to go to. I'm just very unhappy with how things have changed. So just think about my father and how hard it was for him to get into the service during World War II. So my focus a lot of times was on the experiences that he had, which he never talks about. But I'm a big movie buff, so I've seen a lot of movies about the Japanese internment camps. And I also was able to see Allegiance when it was being just the play before the movie, when it was in the show. And I just, tried to tell people to go see it. And I'm still telling them to look for the film because it was fabulous. And I really appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thank you and I'm very sorry I'm late just because of an emergency happened, but I was really looking forward to see it from the beginning, and hopefully I'll see it on the tape. I wanted to share one thought, but also express gratitude. After 9/11, the Muslim community was outreached by the Japanese community because then Attorney Ashcroft had identified, I think, about 300 parks in the United States where they could wrap up the Muslims. And there was a map. It was one of these maps that was leaked. One of them was in Glendale. And I still remember one of the first calls the Muslim community received was from the Japanese community saying, we are going to fund you, we are going to support you, and we're not going to let it happen again. So for this, I feel very gratitude and respect. As we are today, actually this week we may be seeing a new executive order that could talk about picking up people who are from the undocumented community. I'm talking about the DREAM Act or their parents, and people who could be from from certain religious backgrounds, predominantly Muslims today. Um, it's very sad that we have a faculty on our campus, and I'm sure we may have more than a faculty, and we have a lot of students who don't know if they're going to make it home on that day, or they don't know if they're going to see their parents. And we are today in 2017. One of the faculty said, Danny, I cannot even put my parents, who are also undocumented, on my bank account. But I don't know if I'm picked up or my parents are picked up, who is my property going to go to, because I may end up being shipped to another country. It's sad that today, having learned from what happened to the Japanese, some people are planning to what might happen, the worst. So I'm going back to the panel and say, is there anything you can tell us that we can learn, and so that we can really think of alternative choices, because these are on the minds of many people, including naturalized citizens. I don't know if you've learned, not only illegal people or people who are immigrant, who are residents, but even naturalized citizens could have their citizenship stripped based on any document that could be held in secret places where they cannot know why they have been picked up.
Hello.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to give you guys a chance to respond first.
I think Kirsten had something very important to say at the beginning with the historical perspective to everybody. Okay? There's been a lot of very flippant talk about, well, we're just going to get rid of those bad hombres, or we're going to just, we're going to get rid of all this, or we're going to, these sort of blanket statements. And a lot of these blanket statements are being made without legal basis or without consideration of due process. I wish they weren't made at all. But I think that is very important for us to stand up for that as a start. I can tell you that as a faculty member with many hundreds of students in my class at one time sometimes, I consider my classroom a sanctuary as much as this campus. And I know that the chancellors of both the California State and the University of California systems have stated very strongly their positions on this to the president and his staff, and I can tell you that we are frequently at odds with our administration, but in this case, I am in complete agreement. So I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you that's my position. Okay? Does that mean we lock the doors? I would, actually. You're not allowed to disturb my class.
Yes, thank you for bringing us back into today. It's just extraordinary what's happening, and I mean, I've lived in this country, but I'm a naturalized citizen. I'm not a native born. I'm married to a man who's still a Japanese national. Okay, he has permanent residency, but at a time when none of that seems to matter, depending on the particular group you're a member of, and so Japan seems to be okay right now, but who knows, right? We've actually had a semi-serious conversation, my husband and I. Maybe we don't go to Japan for a while, because I don't know if he'll be able to get back in, depending on the whims of, the winds. So it really does have resonance today.
It's a really difficult topic because on the one hand you see where there are some dangers and some things that have happened, they're documented. But on the other hand, to paint everyone with a broad brush is really wrong. So I think they need to be more specific about what they're after. If there's really something that can be documented, then that's something to look at. in the case of Japanese Americans, there were no documented cases of espionage or treason or anything like that. So that was totally off the table on that one. And to, now the problem is you have a lot of people who are taking what's being said in 140 characters or less, that they're taking it to the extreme, that they're justified in being racist. And that's ridiculous. One of the communities I feel the most troubled for is the Sikh community. I mean, they're always identified because of the turbans that they wear, and they're the most peaceful people anywhere. I thought it was interesting that in Northern California, this community of Oroville, which is probably about as far right as you can imagine, that particular area. I went to college in Chico, so I know from a little experience there that the Sikh temples were opening their doors to the people from that community, which I thought was amazing. I thought was really great. So, those types of things are examples that I think people need to realize, no, not everybody's automatically a bad guy just because of where they came from. You need to look at those people and see what they're doing and, and accept that things are different. We're all immigrants at some point, and that, you have to take everything in a measured way, to constantly go back. There was a book by a conservative person talking about defensive internment several years ago. I would not buy the book. I actually stood in a bookstore for about an hour and read through it. So I went out to buy the thing. But, it just infuriated me that they would go through all this trouble to try and, justify something like that in looking at today's, situations. So I think that's something that we have to look at too.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I study the law, and the scary thing to me and the important thing to remember is there are some laws that can allow this to happen again. Fred Korematsu challenged his forced removal from the West Coast, not his incarceration so much, and the Supreme Court was split, but they ruled that that was constitutional. Fred Korematsu's individual conviction was overturned by a federal court, but the Supreme Court has never seen this particular issue since then. And so the way lawyers talk about this is it's still good law, meaning it's a precedent that could still be used in the future. It was used to determine whether or not citizens held in Guantanamo Bay were owed or deserved a trial. And in those cases, they did deserve a trial. But to try and close up the loops and to try to give the federal government broad authority to detain, deport, and possibly even strip people of their citizenship if they're suspected of terrorism, Obama in late December, maybe December 29th of 2011, signed a law that gave the federal government the authority to strip citizens of their citizenship if accused of terrorism. So the reason why the most recent executive order was so flawed is because it treated all people from particular nations the same. But when you get down to individual accusations of terrorism, then there are quite broad legal possibilities available to strip people of their rights in ways that are quite dangerous. So the public needs to be aware, needs to be educated, and needs to speak up, as the panel said. And you wanted to speak.
Say that I was 13 years old in Phoenix when the internments came about, the relocations. And my father, well, there was a town of about 60,000 people then, so we had lots of desert to put buildings in. In fact, we had German prisoners as well. But anyway, my father was a salesman for a automobile parts store, and he made weekly trips to 2 of the relocation centers. And he, third hand, he told me of their stoicism and their patriotism and their work ethic. And yet nobody, until I played golf with your dad, nobody talked about those. and you all prove it too. I thought, yeah, it's strange. But walking the golf course with Jim, I talked about my third-hand observations and his time there. And it was very interesting. Thank you very much.
There was something that I think Tristan mentioned at the very beginning, or maybe it was the conversation we were having. One of the things that just bears repeating because it just blew my mind when I heard this about the relocation and the internment. J. Edgar Hoover, not exactly known as a paragon of a defender of individual liberties, from start to finish, right? He opposed the internment. He opposed it. He said, we don't need to do this. There are, I thought it was 400, it turns out there were 1,200, but in an entire United States, okay.
That included Italian nationals.
Oh, okay, okay. So maybe 400 or 500 Japanese nationals that they were keeping an eye on, okay, and they already had those guys. So he said none of this was necessary. And for that reason, my evaluation of J. Edgar Hoover has a little bit of an asterisk, I thought, good for you. And I sometimes joke he wasn't even wearing a dress when he said it. So that's something that just gives a lie to the whole justification, so to speak. And the case of Hawaii, again, we just found out recently that there actually was a camp in Hawaii, but one, right, and the entire Japanese and Japanese American population of Hawaii was not rounded up. One reason, there were a couple or three, I think, but one reason is that there were so many. The Japanese were like half the population of Hawaii. The state would have come to a screeching halt. Okay, so no, so you don't want to do that. And then I was watching a special. It was on Japanese television. NHK did a special digging into this, and there were a couple of, you might call it, defenders of the Japanese American community in either the mayor of Oahu or like the FBI representative or some such thing in Hawaii at the time, and they spoke up. But also, I mean, there's a practice. Really, you're going to have to shut down Hawaii if you incarcerate everyone. So, I mean, those two things, if nothing else, it just absolutely puts a lie to the justification, so to speak.
One thing happened right after Pearl Harbor was that Hawaii was obviously a territory then, and instead of a National Guard, they had a Hawaiian Territorial Guard. The day after that, their command structure went, wait a minute, over half of our guard is Japanese. What do we do with these guys? I spoke to a couple guys. I was a number of years ago in Maui, and we met with some of these guys, and I asked them, where'd they go? Well, they stuck us out on the beach. They just put us on the beach and said, stay there, because they want them off the base. The late Spark Matsunaga, Senator Spark Matsunaga, he was an officer, and he was very offended because they told him to stand down. In other words, they had to turn any firearms that he had and give up that authority. And then this gentleman I met who was from Maui, I said, so when did your parents find out that you were no longer on Kauai? When they got a letter from me from Wisconsin, because they put them on the SS Maui. Next thing they knew, they were in Oakland. They were put on a train with the shades drawn. They ended up in Wisconsin, and they stayed there training and retraining for well over a year before they were allowed to go into battle. And they were the original 100th Battalion of the 442nd. And their story is legendary. But it's amazing because that's really what happened. They couldn't shut down anything, and they had all these guys that were all Japanese American, and they really didn't know what to do with them. But they went on, and they really proved themselves in Europe.
I wanted to give a shout out, by the way, to the Park Service. If you don't know, in the past, I don't know, was it 5 to 10 years, I guess, the Park Service has done actually quite a lot of work making sure that a lot of these locations are being recognized. And in fact, the archaeologist from Manzanar just went to Hawaii to help establish the national monument there with his experience, having worked and Manzanar. And so there's a domino effect that's beginning to happen with the different locations from all the different assembly centers and relocation camps, so that there's at least a physical public presence acknowledging some of these places. Unfortunately, many of them are quite remote, and so it's not easy to visit them. But it's I mean, obviously Churston and their students are doing so, which is great. But it's one of those things where it's I love the National Park Service and national monuments and so on. So it's another one of those institutions that is, however, weirdly under siege. Because, oh well, I mean, if somebody established a national monument in the last 8 years, it must be a bad thing, and so so there's funding is being retracted for some of these places. So, but fortunately, some of them have had enough infrastructure put in place that it's going to be tough to remove them. So that's one thing, and then as Ari said, the entire state of Hawaii would have ground to a halt. Well, you know what? If we start talking about losing immigrants, the entire state of California is going to grind to a halt. And by the way, broccoli in the Midwest will cost $8 a pound, right? So, we have some power, I think. We have a voice, and it might be economic. We'll have to see.
So I mentioned, besides Manzanar is an example of what can be done. A camp that really hasn't been done much with is Tule Lake, and you know there's a lot of effort going on there. That whole area, it's in the northeast corner of California, which is admittedly, I think, a very racist area. There, when they would go back there to try and do ceremonies, this one guy on a crop duster would buzz their ceremonies so they couldn't do anything, until they left. Other things happened. The cemetery is there. Evidently, there's a big hole in the ground where the cemetery was. After the camp was dissolved and the cemetery is still there, they used that for fill. They dug it up and just dumped it, so there's parts of people everywhere in that area used for fill. I mean, can you imagine if that had been done with a Native American community or any other community? That would have been an outrage, but it wasn't for them. So there's a lot of things that happen in places like that that we really don't hear about, but they're trying to establish that. And what is the name of the act? It's like it's got a really funny name. The National Park something Act. No, it was something else. I'll have to look it up, but anyway.
So Tule Lake was just recently added to the National Park Service, so they're going through a review process. If any of you want to make comments about what the interpretation plan should be, they're accepting comments at this time. And the camp in Hawaii was recently made a National Historic Landmark, and so it also is under the purview of the national parks now. Do you follow Jeff Burton on Facebook? Is that how you found out, or? No, actually, I spoke to the archaeologist at Manzanar the day before we left. Oh, cool. So that's great. Jeff Burton and Mary Farrell are both archaeologists, and they did all of the survey work for that particular site. But they were just recently there, and their friends were saying, how many more sites are you going to find? Because they were visiting not just the formal campsites, but the informal jails, and at least, I counted at least 6 separate sites beyond the one that we know of, these tiny little cells that people were put in temporarily until they could be transferred to the more formal camps. So they're doing really important work right now.
World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument.
To which we said that's going to be a really hard thing to interpret. Renunciation of citizenship, repatriation requests, no respondents, and so on when the name of your site is the Valor in the Pacific at Tule Lake. Yeah, that's good, thanks. Any other questions? Heather will let you take the last question, and then we'll let you all comment, say the last things you want to say.
I just wanted to say thank you for all of your presentations. One of the recurring themes that I've noticed is this silence. And so I'm wondering, now that we're discussing the National Park Service and all of that, is there anything besides, say, monuments or any sort of avenues that we could take with the youth or just the general public that would raise the awareness of this unfortunate circumstance that happened? I'm currently doing my master's thesis on the post-war resettlement in the South Bay area and the community development between 1940s and 50s and basically up to the civil rights movement. So in focus on this trauma and silence and it being one of the components of my thesis, I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around how this would apply to current day issues and how we could essentially, you know, prevent something like this from happening again. I mean, this is the whole point of this talk, but as Dr. Sumida pointed out, there's only 4 sentences in, you know, public school systems, and we need some other avenues. I mean, the National Park Service is wonderful, but do we have any other ideas?
I have so much to say, always. Thank you for your stories and for sharing your family stories. My grandparents were immigrants as well, Greek and Italian, not treated the way your families were, but nonetheless raised hearing things like that. To answer your question or to comment on your question, I'm a grandmother, a mother. I have a lot of kids. I think it starts at home. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, I know the reason, but we don't have time, but our public school systems, the books that are taught to our children, I didn't realize it till I came to college. It blows my mind, the ignorance and what our kids are taught in elementary and high school. Our government is so afraid to admit the issues that they've caused and the harm that they've caused to people. And yes, that happens all over the world, but it starts at home because I still have an 8-year-old and I'll tell her all the time, that's not what really happened. That's not what really happened. You have to be empathetic and educate and research. And unfortunately, like you said up in Thule, we're not taught, we're raised, I hate to say it, gosh, you know, if you're not white, you're nothing. That's how I feel. It's still that way, unfortunately. And I know I'm talking in circles, but I wish, I hope, and I pray on what you're doing to bring more awareness to the elementary and high school levels, because it's not until you get to college that you go, oh my God. I feel like I've been slapped in the face with what we've been taught. And that's not okay. It's not okay. And so I don't know, other than hopefully parents who are open-minded and compassionate and want to educate their children with the truth, but maybe they don't know the truth, those ignorant people up in Thule, you know, and around the country. So I just wanted to comment on that because I think it's so important, and I get so frustrated when I have to correct my kids and what they're being taught in school that it's not true and correct. So sorry, I'll just sit here and rant forever, but yeah.
So, you know, I'm sorry. I'm a university professor. I'm used to yelling. So first of all, I think we're making a start, right? If you look at this room, it's very diverse. I have to say it's very means a lot to me to see Mary Texera here. We came to Cal State the same year. We went through faculty advising and orientation the same year, and people like Danny and all the other people who are here today. I appreciate that. And so if you look in the audience, it's not all Japanese Americans. It's a mixture, and I appreciate that. That means a lot to us up here, I think. I think it would mean something to my grandfather were he here. My father was in the Air Force. And oh my gosh, when I drove up to Nevada with him, he was going 85. He got pulled over twice, and he never got a ticket. And both the Nevada and the California Highway Patrolman said to him, "By the way, sir, thank you for your service." Right? How many people who were incarcerated had family members who were in the service? And you know the story of the 442nd, the most decorated battalion in the history of the country. No one would hesitate to say to those people, "Thank you for your service," ever. And they would do so with pride. So what we need to start doing at the places, and I was at the Rose Bowl, and the jets flew over, and they asked all the veterans to stand. And I saw old men saluting with tears. We need to start saying, "Thank you for your service, and if this happened to you, for your sacrifice." And we need to start hooking those things together so that people see the bigger picture, that these things happen to people we call patriots or people we call heroes. There are people who join the Army to become American citizens. Okay? And now we honor them as heroes when they come back from war. Well, we need to start hooking that patriotism up to these kinds of events so that we can see that the reason they go to war is so that these things don't happen again, I think. And so I think, maybe it's a tenuous connection, but doing things like that can't hurt, in my opinion. So.
Stuart, there's 4 boys in my family. We all served in the U.S. Army, and I volunteered. My 3 other brothers, they were drafted, and I don't know which one is smarter or what, but I spent one extra year with the U.S. Army, and during my 3 years of experience, no one had ever mentioned anything about the internment of Japanese Americans. That information is just not there in my generation. It's not there, and I think some of it is coming up through the public school system, not the charter system.
Thank you. Just with what's happening right now in the country, I am heartened that unlike in 42, there are more people outside of the Muslim community speaking up. Okay, I think our community did have defenders, but they were very few and far between, and it was like one sort of principled person standing up here and another. But it's a little bit more of a movement, a resistance movement, I guess some people are calling it. So that part, I'm a little bit more heartened by, but it's still so scary. 75 years later, we may be right back, in the same place. So.
I think it's an interesting discussion today. I'm glad to see everyone here and get your questions and see what your viewpoints are as well. So I think it's important that this kind of dialogue keeps going on, that there are challenges from both sides, that there needs to be more of a coming together in the middle of the polarization that we've been having. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult things, is that everyone's taking this place to way to the left or way to the right. We need to start talking some more. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people I know well that are making knee-jerk reactions off to the left, and it doesn't help, that matter at all either. So I think there needs to be more centering of the discussion.
And I think education has a key role in that. Educational institutions are supposed to be an oasis for discussion and tolerance of all perspectives. Oh my goodness, my dad's one of the most conservative people I know. So, it can be done. So it can be done, and this is a great step towards doing that. And I thank everybody for attending. And as I said, I was very honored to get to sit with this group today. It means a lot to me. Thank you.